Imagine going on an opulent cruise and discovering that beneath the gleaming decks and contented crew lurks a horror that no one discusses. Travelers vanish, impossibly twisting corridors. The fog moves as if it were alive, and there's always someone or something lurking in the shadows. These tales are factual. Reddit threads and other witness statements attest to the fact that these encounters are authentic. Every event was cross-checked, and every name was altered. You will wonder what's happening behind the ship's doors after hearing what I have to say, so stay with me. First story. I swear I saw her standing there, but she was gone when I blinked. I'm Harper Sullivan, a 28-year-old San Diego-based freelance travel writer. I went on this cruise to get away from a harsh winter and to do research for an article about contemporary luxury cruises, but I didn't expect to find anything. I saw an odd fog swirling strangely near the windows in the atrium, where the ship had just left port. The majority of the passengers were asleep, and the sun was just beginning to rise. The only sounds in the air were the hum of the engines and the slight squeak of polished metal. I followed my curiosity and headed toward Deck 6 down a strange hallway. The official sign read "Crew Only," but a door opened just enough to let me in, or perhaps to warn me. First came rust, damp wood, and a subtle sweetness reminiscent of rotting flowers. The hallway inside was impossible. Cabin numbers 414, 417, 414, and 418 were skipped in illogical patterns. Some areas of the carpet were drenched, but the lights overhead flickered as though nothing was damp. I stopped and jotted down every detail. Then, a little laugh reached my ears. It was an unusual chuckle, thin, twisted, and airy. I spun around. At the end of the corridor stood a woman, pale, fuzzy, nearly merging with the fog. Slowly, with a small smile, she raised her hand. I blinked, and she was gone. My heart was pounding. The passageway felt alive, with the walls expanding and narrowing and bending gradually. My face grew longer. Shadow faces emerged behind me, mouths moving silently, and reflections in polished panels warped. A soft hum pulled me closer. Without swiping anything, the keycard reader blinked green as I arrived at a door marked simply, "Storage." The handle felt chilly. I pulled it open. Nothing but well-piled cartons within. One crate made a small movement. I took one step closer. A tiny brass key rested atop, throbbing softly. I snatched it after hesitating. The crate shifted, like breathing, as soon as my fingers touched the metal. The lights flashed wildly, and a whisper came from the vents. "Not yours. Not yours." I felt a cold go through me. I moved away. The hallway behind me appeared to wind into itself. With the door slightly open, cabin 417 emerged. Water was dripping inside, and I could hear it. Cabin 417's interior was knee-deep in water. It was soggy, and the pillows were floating. From the other side of the mirror, I could see scores of pale faces pressed against the glass. They didn't talk. Instead of moving like people, they resembled reflections of terror. Wet but too tiny for any adult, I saw tiny footprints leading from the bathroom to the door. Next came the dozens of whispering voices speaking at once, piled one on top of the other. I had one distinct idea: the brass key was more than just a key. A warning, a tether, and a guide. I cautiously left the chamber, following the key's dim glimmer down what seemed to be an unending hallway. Doors swam and vanished. Passengers I had seen earlier in the day, grinning and laughing, were reflected in panels, but when I turned around, they were gone. I stopped by a stairway that led to Deck 5 below. All the details and every whisper were captured on my jogging recorder. Trying to keep my voice steady, I set into it. If anyone finds this, and if you want more verified true cruise horror accounts, subscribe to Midnight Outcry. It helps keep these stories alive. The stairs went dark. A metallic, damp odor ascended. Discordant and eerie, faint singing resounded from below. Cabin 417's water appeared to collect around the stairwell and trickle down the stairs. There was a disturbance below. Even though I couldn't see anything, I could sense it. Patiently, waiting, watching. I inhaled deeply before lowering myself. The ship overhead now appeared to be so far away. With a spooky metallic echo for every step, I walked down the stairway into the dark. I felt the faint pulse of the brass key in my palm, as though it were calling me on. The bottom water was cold and strangely motionless as it lapped at my ankles. Far beyond the ship's formal layout, the hallway was unreasonably long. Numbers on the cabins came and went, then came again. 414, 415, 414, 416. The sequence seemed illogical. A few doors were ajar, exposing shadows that were too swift to be human. I kept my recorder close at hand, documenting each aberration and warped reflection. A dissonant, gentle lullaby resounded from the vents. On the recorder, it almost seemed to mock me by superimposing itself over my own speech. I stopped. An image of a woman with hollow eyes and a pallid face flashed in one of the cabin mirrors. She held out her hand, gave me a small smile, and vanished as soon as I turned around. The hallway turned again. The Deck 3 maintenance door was open, even though the space was meant to be sealed. Carefully, I stepped inside. The lights went out and back again. The water dripped from the corners, creating puddles that mirrored hundreds of faces, all of them silently watching, their lips opening and closing as if they were trying to talk. I moved forward. Vibrantly, the brass key pulsed. Just above the water, the crate from the upper decks materialized in front of me. I disregarded the voice that went through the vents as I reached out and inserted the key, saying, "You shouldn't touch it. Not yet." A set of ancient ship manifests and a second key that was exactly like mine were shown when the box clicked and opened. I recognized some of the names of the passengers listed here who had been missing for years, but others were from decades before. From faded photos, their features gazed at me. Behind me, I heard footsteps, slow, coordinated, several sets coming. I turned around. Not a thing. There are only damp footprints that are impossible to create on the ceiling and walls. My heart beat faster. With each heartbeat, the water level appeared to climb. I saw a door at the end of the hallway that was marked 419. My stomach fell. A few weeks prior, cabin 419 had disappeared from all official records. There was a small gap in the door. The room seemed to be breathing as water dripped from it. I took a cautious approach. Chest-deep flooding filled the room. Passenger shadows drifted beneath the river, their faces contorted in quiet fear. I remembered Alyssa from a previous encounter in the lounge. Her lips moved inaudibly, creating words I couldn't hear. A slight vibration shook the floorboards. The brass key throbbed wildly. Ripples spread strangely across the lake as the crate floated toward me. I gripped both keys and pushed forward as the whispers combined into one overwhelming command. Give, stay, choose, give, stay. The corridor's walls started to fold in, creating impossibly sharp angles as the water rushed past me. Distorted shadows took the place of faces that first showed in reflections before disappearing. The warped lullaby was layered over every echo, and I could hear faint gasps and cries for assistance. With a blank look, Alyssa floated closer and pointed to a secret stairwell marked Deck 0, which, in reality, didn't exist. Every thought was twisted by anxiety as my chest constricted. The brass key was tying me to this room and making me make a decision, I realized, not leading me to safety. I whispered, my voice shaking into my recorder. This isn't just a ship. It is a trap that is changing its shape. Deck 0, every single traveler. When the water surged violently, shadows collected, and the stairwell opened beneath the floors, revealing a dark emptiness waiting. If anyone finds this, please subscribe to Midnight Outcry. It helps keep these verifiable encounters alive. I moved forward, no going back. Darkness appeared to engulf light itself as the stairs plunged below. My footsteps echoed like a gunshot in a cavern as the water rose over my knees. I was almost led to anything waiting below by the pulsing metal key in my hand. I arrived at the bottom and entered Deck 0, an insurmountable chamber. The area extended well beyond the official ship blueprints. The corridors split at illogical angles. The metal walls glistened as though they were alive, reflecting the faces of passengers that shouldn't have been there. Once more, Alyssa emerged, standing on a platform that was partially submerged in water. Her face was expressionless, her lips moving in a twisted lullaby that was stacked over hundreds of murmurs without sound. Floating close by, the lounge youngster gazed with unwavering eyes. I moved ahead with caution. The sea writhed with shadows. Some passengers' faces were twisted in fear, while others were laughing as they hovered just beneath the surface. I became aware that every move I made shook the water and the world. I was urged toward a floating container that was just like the one I had seen before by the furious pulse of the brass key. I made it there. Photographs a second similar key and manifests were found inside. A brass plate read, "To leave you must choose, one to stay or all remain." The murmurs blended into a single deafening voice. Choose, give, remain. Choose, give, remain. My heartbeat drew faster. Water was rushing around me in an unusual way, making the room appear alive. I saw that the brass key was more than a guide. It was a tether that bound me to this room and made me make a decision. Shadows stretched out, leaping from the walls and floor, but vanishing before they could reach me. The chamber would decide for me if there was no decision. At the far end of the room, where a stairwell led to what appeared to be ordinary decks above, Alyssa gently lifted her hand. The youngster floated closer, lullabies distorted, eyes wide and unblinking, and I murmured into my recorder, "If anyone finds this, and if you like true cruise horror encounters, subscribe to Midnight Outcry. It helps keep these verified accounts alive." Water rushed, shadows forming a soaring figure, a crewman too tall to be real, eyes vacant, uniform shedding water that shouldn't be there. I inserted the crate's first key. Something clicked. The darkness shrank back a moment. I inserted the second key into a slot on the floor. A gust of wind carried words of relief and anguish at the same time as the room trembled, the water rushing fiercely. The water went away. The darkness vanished. Suddenly, the child's lullaby came to an end. Alyssa was gone. The ship's official layout does not show Deck 0. It was gone. Everything appeared normal when they returned to a familiar hallway. The world went on as like nothing had happened, and passengers grinned as the sun reflected off the polished rails. However, my recorder picked up slight murmurs, light ripples and reflections, and drips that shouldn't have been on the floor. I stumbled to the guest services desk. With a courteous smile, the clerk said, "Deck 0, underdeck chamber, passengers missing. All passengers are present, sir. Maybe you're under stress." I walked away with the brass key in my hand. It dawned on me that the chamber had not vanished, but rather was concealed, altering itself and waiting for the next visitor to approach too closely. Somewhere deep within the ship came 3 gentle but purposeful knocks. I felt my heart freeze. There was silence. I went back to my cabin, pulse pounding and soaked. I held the cold, weighty, and unnaturally heavy brass key in my palm. Whispers, twisted lullabies, and the brief reflections of passengers who ought to have been alive filled my recorder as I played it repeatedly. With families laughing, sunshine glinting off polished rails, and music from the lounge resonating through the corridors, the ship above appeared to be operating normally. However, I knew what was underneath. Deck 0 was waiting, hidden, and there. I gave guest services another go. My voice wavered. Deck 0, lower chamber, flooded corridors, missing passengers. The clerk handed me a pamphlet with a courteous smile. "There have been no reports of maintenance problems, sir. All of the cabins are present. Maybe the journey is stressing you out?" I moved back out into the corridor. The displays displayed the faces of passengers from decades past, with each reflection warped. Some people muttered, others wept in silence. I came to see that the chamber had not vanished. Rather, it had altered reality by blending in with the ship and remaining undetected. I was unable to fall asleep. The key made of brass gleamed dimly on my bedside table. I saw shadows that flashed in improbable patterns, faint ripples emerging in puddles of water that shouldn't have been there, and minute movements in mirrors. Through the vents came the distorted, gentle lullaby. Convincing myself that was a delusion, I attempted to flee. But when I moved, the ship changed somewhat. The hallways I'd passed before looked different. Numbers in the cabins altered. Independently moving reflections occasionally revealed passengers who had long since disappeared. I walked to the stairs that led beneath the ship for one more try. I was uncertain whether it would lead to Deck 0 once more or merely to a routine maintenance area. As I lowered myself, the water immediately rose, soaking my clothing. Flickering shadows merged into tall, hollow-eyed crewmen that hung strangely toward me. With a pounding heart, I gripped the brass key tightly. The second key began to pulse. I put it in my pocket, aware that it was more than just metal. It was a reminder that the ship had memory, purpose, and patience, as well as a tether to the chamber. Already, hundreds had been lost. I might be the next to be claimed. Then I came out onto the upper deck. As sunlight broke through the fog, ordinary passengers passed by without noticing. The smallest whisper in the wind was caught by my recorder. Next time. 3 purposeful knocks resounded from below, quiet yet determined. I stopped. There was silence. I am currently sitting in my cabin and looking at the brass key. I haven't had any sleep. I didn't move it. I hear soft whispering, sporadic creaks, and faint leaking coming from places that shouldn't be there. The ship continues to cruise, unaware of its mysteries below deck. One thing I am aware of is that Deck 0 waits, waiting all the time. Furthermore, the next traveler who wanders into its hallways might never come back. Story 2. What's causing this fog inside the ship? I stopped in the middle of my stride. I'm 32-year-old Miami logistics manager Ethan Morales. I purchased this vacation in order to finally relax, take a break, and forget about deadlines following months of hectic work. What I discovered instead was an inexplicable nightmare. The upper decks of the ship had been swallowed by a peculiar early morning fog as it glided through it. Most of the passengers were still asleep, and there was none of the typical deck conversation. All I could hear was the faint creak of metal and the hum of engines. Leaning over Deck 7's railing, I anticipated seeing only white mist. Rather, I saw shadows moving far below, where it shouldn't even be possible to see the lower decks from this vantage point. I felt drawn down by something. I was following the lights in the corridors toward Deck 4 because of something, whether it was curiosity, stubbornness, or pure fear. Like rust and old perfume, the air had a strange, wet, metallic, yet slightly pleasant fragrance. In the elevator, I pressed the key card. According to official logs, Deck 4 was solely intended for crew access at this hour. The elevator doors nevertheless slid open. A silence descended. The silence felt oppressive, as though the ship itself was holding its breath rather than the quiet of deserted corridors. I left. It was a familiar but incorrect passageway. Some of the skipped cabin numbers matched the numbers of passengers I had heard about going missing on previous voyages. Despite the dry ceiling lights, the carpet appeared to be wet in several areas. I went by cabin 419. The door was open just a crack. I wanted to avoid looking, but I couldn't help myself. It was knee-deep in water inside the room. A trail of damp footsteps went from one corner to the next. In the middle was an open suitcase, its contents undamaged except for a little brass key that pulsed weakly on top. The key fell into my palm before I knew it. I stretched out, and a mumble came from the vents. "Don't take it, don't take it." In contrast to the cold in the room, it was warm. When I pressed it against the suitcase's lock, a map of the ship appeared as it clicked open even more. Passengers were unaware of the map, though. Secret passageways, doors that don't exist, and stairs that go nowhere. The paper ship was reconfiguring itself, living. Behind me, in the corridor, I heard footsteps, soft, tentative, almost contrite. I turned, but with nothing. Unnaturally, only shadows extended along the walls. I pulled out my recorder and began narrating. Every distorted reflection, every odd number on the cabins, every detail. My own voice sounded weird when it was played back, like there was a faint murmur behind the words, layered beneath mine. I attempted to go. The corridor seemed to continue on forever. The doors I had previously passed had been replaced by walls. Cabin 419 loomed once more, but this time it had a wet, darker, and taller door. In my hand, the key pulsed more rapidly. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here," came the words again, in more than one voice, and I froze. The fog from above deck crawled toward me as it soaked into the hallway and gathered on the carpet. I wanted to yell, but the reverberating quiet drowned out my own words. I saw motion in a mirror at the end of the corridor. It's not a reflection of myself. A crewman in a whitish outfit is walking backward. I couldn't hear the words he spoke, his mouth slightly wide, and his eyes vacant. He held up a hand in my direction. I had no mobility. The key then gave a strong pulse. With spiderweb lines extending out, the mirror broke. He vanished. The ship's layout felt off as a chilly breeze shoved me ahead into the room of the fog itself, where stairwells hung in midair and corridors were piled on top of one another. With each stride I took, I staggered forward, and then I saw it, a stairway marked Deck 0. This ship does not, in fact, have Deck 0. The brass key nearly guided me as it pulsed gently in my hand. So I went down. A large cavern at the bottom has water dripping from pipes above it. Below the surface, the pallid, rigid, wide-eyed shadows of passengers stared at nothing. A youngster was the only figure in the center, singing a gentle, dissonant lullaby. Each note twisted like smoke in the air. I made a grab for the kid. Slowly it looked around. Its face wavered, pallid and hollow, half rotten, half normal. I felt a knot in my stomach. The footsteps behind me came back, slower now, moving in unison, many sets coming from every side. The air was getting thicker, and the walls were getting smaller. Even after I dropped my recorder, it continued to record. After hearing a whisper so near that it felt like it was within my brain, I understood that the key was meant to be used for bargaining rather than escape. "Give us something, or you'll stay." I attempted to turn around, but the hallways had once more transformed. The doors I had previously passed were now facing the opposite directions, and some of the numbers were repeating. Water was dripping onto the carpet outside when cabin 419 reappeared in front. With a heavy heartbeat, I swallowed and continued on. There was a slight pulse to the brass key in my hand, like if it had its own heartbeat. Every door I passed had it jammed against it, some unlocked, some stuck. Whispers, some menacing, others imploring, mixed in 100 tones, accompanied every step. The shadow at one corner moved strangely quickly. I glimpsed the edge of a crewman's uniform, but when I turned completely, there was no one. Just damp footsteps that follow impossible patterns on ceilings and walls. The corridor I was in was flooded. Water swallowed my shoes and surged to my knees. Dozens of pale, staring faces with their mouths open and mute screaming were reflected in the shallow waves. All the faces looked familiar. I'd seen her during breakfast. One of the men from the deck lounge. Omitted from other decks. Through the ship came a quiet thrum. Something beneath the hull was vibrating through the floor, not the engines. At that moment, I understood that the ship itself contributed to the fear. Some invisible force caused every door, hallway, and reflection to react. I continued, tracing a fading light above a stairwell marked Deck 0, the same impossibly difficult floor I had previously seen. The key flashed brightly in my pocket as I went down, drawing me down like a compass. The stench of rust and wet concrete filled the air as it grew colder. I could hear a lullaby distorted via the vents, a faint singing sound. Ahead, the hallway led to a bigger room. When the water reached the mid-thigh, shadows shifted beneath it and curled upward like outstretched hands. An elaborate brass lock secured a floating container in the middle. The key was instantly recognizable to me. I walked over. Open it, give us." The murmurs increased in volume. My hands shook, the key pulsating and heated. My hand went into the lock. The box shifted on the water like it was alive, clicking. There were passenger documents, manifests, and photos. Some from decades ago, some lost from the ship. I could see their faces through the yellowed prints. I felt a cold go through me. Abruptly, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, coordinated, coming from all sides. My flashlight shook as I spun around. Not a thing. Just rippling in the water, where there shouldn't be shadows. It was whispered softly, "You shouldn't be here. Go now, or stay forever." The container trembled wildly. A piece of paper rose and drifted in my direction, displaying a map with rooms and hallways not included in the official plans. In a matter of seconds, the water in the chamber rose quickly to my chest. I became panicked. The hallway curved unnaturally as I dashed toward the dim glow of a stairwell. As though something beneath it knew I was there, the water started to churn and the walls twisted, narrowing and expanding. I took a quick look at the water's reflection. Just below the surface, I could see the faces of missing passengers, some of them contorted, some smiling, all of them observing me. One of them, a kid I knew from the lounge, held up its hand. I tripped and fell back into the water. Gasping for air, I scurried to the stairway. In my pocket, the key throbbed wildly. I jammed it into a cavity in the wall of the stairs. Beyond Deck 0, an inconceivable underdeck chamber, a panel pulled open to expose another ladder going further. The metal walls echoed with the growing intensity of the singing lullabies. Below the water, shadows rose to the surface and reached for me. I sprinted. Stay. Give. Never leave. I came to a dead end, a hallway that stopped abruptly in darkness as the water rushed and the murmurs in the air began to form words. The water level surpassed my waist. Desperately, I held onto the key. A shadow moved toward me, humanoid but incorrect, and broke free from the distant wall. It had sunken eyes and a softly moving lips. Then, there was another pulse of the brass key. The wall had a secret entrance that slid open. I made no hesitation. I plunged through it, not knowing what lay beneath, into the next chapter of this nightmare. There was a quiet, metallic sigh as the secret door closed behind me. I waded through water up to my waist, and my chest heaved. Wet metal and corrosion filled the air, as if the ship had been breathing underwater for decades. The underdeck compartment where I was much larger than any room should reasonably be, and extended well beyond the ship's official blueprints. The shadows twisted strangely as they flickered over the walls. Some appeared to be crew members, while others were passengers, all warped and paralyzed by silent fear. The child from the lounge was standing on a flooded platform in the center of the room, a lullaby softly resonating, and I recognized him. In my pocket, the metal key throbbed, persistent and heated. It was directing me. I tried to move, but the water resisted, rippling with invisible force. My recorder was recording every step, catching the words that appeared to build upon one another. Stay, stay, stay. Long, unnatural shapes were formed by the upward curvature of shadows beneath the surface. One brushed my arm with its reach. It was as if there was lightning running beneath my skin. Then I noticed her. Alyssa, a fellow traveler I had previously met, giggling over a few cocktails. On a floating chair, she stood motionless, her eyes vacant. Whispering her name, I gently walked up to her. She remained silent. I was drawn in as the water surrounding her started to swirl. The metal key was anchoring me to reality, I realized, not merely directing me. If I didn't have that, the chamber would swallow me whole. I pushed it up against a gap in the floor. Hundreds of faces, travelers who had vanished throughout the years, were illuminated by a dim radiance that spread. I was followed by their gaze. Words I couldn't hear were formed by the silent movements of lips. The child's song became louder and began to overlay with hundreds of little whispers. All the faces in the room turned in perfect harmony toward me. I stumbled as the water suddenly changed. A crewman in a spotless uniform came out of the far end of the room, expressionless. She pointed to a floating container. The brass lock was familiar to me. It matched my key. I waited in its direction. Without moving, the box pulsed like a heartbeat as it bobbed over the water. I inserted the key. To leave, you must choose something in return, someone to stay, or the chamber keeps both. I froze when the container opened to show a second key that was exactly the same as the first. Fear swept through them. Lowly, Alyssa raised her arm behind me and gestured at me. I wanted to talk, but I couldn't. As the murmurs combined to form a chant, choose, give, remain, choose, give, remain, I understood that the key was actually a tether connecting this world to the chamber underneath the ship, a bargaining chip. If there was no other option, the ship itself would make the decision, and it never showed mercy. Grasping both keys, I continued. With the walls folding in on themselves and the ceiling disappearing into the darkness, the room seemed to stretch indefinitely. Just below the surface, frozen and pale, were the faces of missing passengers. With increased speed, shadows formed humanoid figures that lunged but never touched. With a blank expression and lips moving in time with the chant, Alyssa took a step closer. If anyone ever finds this, and if you like true cruise horror stories, subscribe to Midnight Outcry. It helps keep these verified accounts alive, I said, gesturing with the brass key into my recorder. She paused. As though listening to my voice, the whispers paused for a second. The water then roared violently. A single imposing figure emerged from the shadows, a crew member, unnaturally tall, with hollow eyes and a suit that was leaking water. I sprinted. As I walked toward the far side of the chamber, my legs pulsated in response to the water's pull. Reaching out, the child floated in front of me. I avoided it. Whispers turned into yells. I came to a half-submerged stairwell. The key throbbed wildly. With water rushing behind me, I plunged into the stairwell. With each step being heavier than the last, my lungs burnt. I stepped out into a deck I knew, the top passenger area, normal and ordinary, as if nothing had happened. Stay, 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 the voices in the shadows behind me said, overlapping into one loud demand. I had wet clothes. My heart was pounding. Alyssa was no longer there. The compartment, the infant, the crew member, all disappeared. The brass key, however, shone dimly in my pocket. This wasn't over, I knew. I had barely survived after the ship had exposed its secret, but the underdeck compartment was still there, waiting. I arrived at guest services stumbling. My voice wavered. With a courteous smile, the clerk said, "Deck 0, lower chamber, passengers missing, please." "Sir, Deck 0 does not exist. No room. Do you feel good?" The ship was normal to everyone else, but I had caught a glimpse of its reality, I realized. Additionally, I had evidence with me in the form of the key, my recorder, and the recollection of hundreds of hollow eyes gazing up from the water. Ignorant of the atrocities below, the upper deck felt normal, with passengers smiling and sipping coffee as the light glinted off polished rails. With my garments drenched and my mind reeling, I gripped the brass key hard. Everything around me seems too normal, but I was aware of the reality. Deck 0 was present. There was the underdeck compartment. Moreover, it continued to wait. With a pounding heart, I made my way back to the stairs that led down. Although the murmurs had stopped for the time being, I could still clearly recall the child's warped song and dead eyes. Everything was captured by my recorder, even every echo and creak. It was the only evidence anyone who trusted me could have. Slowly, I went down. Like a heartbeat, the brass key throbbed in my palm. Deeper into the room, I sensed its guidance. The water rose quicker than ever and lapped at my knees. Beneath the surface, shadows swirled, taking on human forms before fading. The same crate as previously, but bigger and heavier, drifted in the middle. The second key, which was the same as mine, lay on top. A polished metal plate bore the note again: "Choose, or the chamber chooses for you." The shadows came together to form a single, enormous figure. It screamed silently as its soulless eyes stared into mine. I sensed it, making judgments and choosing my destiny. Behind it, people who were submerged in the water writhed slowly and silently, begging. In the reflections, Alyssa's face was distorted and white. I understood the necessary action. There are 2 keys, one for the chamber and one for the box. They could either use the key to anchor the chamber and capture someone, or they could give it up and let the creature devour the entire ship. I was hesitant. Time moved more slowly. The child's eyes were wide and unblinking as they floated ahead, distorting lullaby. The pressure of hundreds of invisible passengers was palpable. I inserted the first key into the lock of the crate at last. Something clicked. A little radiance filled the room. Reluctant, the shadows swirled like smoke into the ocean. Taking the second key, I slipped it into the slot in the floor. The room trembled, water rushing wildly. A blast of wind blew into my face, bearing with it gentle murmurs of both relief and anguish. The water went away. The darkness disappeared. Suddenly, the child's lullaby came to an end. Stillness. I stumbled out onto the stairway, trembling, breathless, and soaked. Deck 0 had vanished. It had disappeared. The cabins were typical. Numbers line up. Passenger areas were once again normal. Nobody else had noticed anything. Guest services grinned courteously as they gazed at me. "Is everything all right, sir?" I displayed the brass key. "This demonstrates it. There is Deck 0, the compartment below deck." "Missing passengers." They shook their heads. "All passengers are present, sir. Maybe you're anxious." I walked out with the recorder. The brass key pulsated softly again, then cooled. I went back to my cabin and watched the video. In reflections, shadows moved stealthily. The youngster's visage shifted in a mirror. There were water droplets on the floor where none should have been. Hardly audible, the lullaby echoed. The room hadn't disappeared, I realized. It waited, concealed, changing its form. And it would call back someday. On my bedside table, I have the brass key. I'm not going to touch it. However, I am aware that it will only be a short while until someone else gets too close. The final sound I captured that evening was 3 intentional knocks reverberating in my chamber from somewhere far inside the ship. I listened, my heart pounding, and froze. And then there was quiet. The name was never on the manifest, but she walked the deck like she belonged. My name is Simon Hartley, and I am a 31-year-old investigative journalist from Boston. I expected to read about the latest trends in luxury travel when I booked this Mediterranean vacation, but instead, I got something more sinister. Something that has no right to exist. I saw her as the ship had just sailed out of port. At the railing, she stood by herself, staring down at the dark blue lake. Eyes penetrating but distracted, her hair clinging to her shoulders from the sea breeze. She wasn't a passenger, the crew told me, and I had never seen her before. She was free to roam the decks, though. I assumed I was dreaming at first. The distant clink of glasses, the buzz of the motors, and the laughing of the passengers are all typical. She was closer every time I glanced, though. Constantly following the same route in silence, in perfect sync with the ship's timetable. I silently trailed her to Deck 7. Every door she went by looked to slant slightly. Some numbers appeared twice, while others skipped. The stench of mildew, mingled with something sweet and metallic, permeated the corridor. Every stride I took, every creak, every faint echo was captured on my recorder. And then she was gone. I blinking. Dim lights and polished walls were all that was visible. "You shouldn't follow." I hurried to guest services to try to confirm her identification after hearing a tiny whisper brush by my ear. "I need the name of this passenger who is wandering the ship." I said. The cashier scowled. "All of the passengers are present, sir. The list includes everyone. Maybe you should get some sleep." Something wasn't right. My intuition cried out for it. I came back to the hallway. The lights went out and back again. Doors were moved around. Cabin 720 disappeared completely, while 722 changed to 724. Her picture was briefly reflected in a tiny puddle before she vanished. The smallest murmur was caught on my recorder, and I froze. Simon. The faint but unexpected sound of my own name. I found the theater by following a faint buzz. Even though the room was empty, the seats were drenched. I was alone, yet footsteps headed to the stage. A velvet pillow on the stage held a single metal key. I took it up. It had a little pulse, as if it were a living thing. Its warmth decreased the once I touched it. The murmur turned into a low chant of whispers. Crawling around the walls in vague human shapes, shadows moved at an impossible pace. I lurched backward, holding the recorder to my chest, and murmured into it. If anyone finds this and subscribe to Midnight Outcry, it helps keep these stories alive. The key pulsed once again. The darkness froze. It was a lure, a link to something concealed beneath the ship, and I recognized it was more than just a key. Although it was marked as sealed, I discovered a stairwell that led down, Deck 0. Water slid up swiftly from below. Slowly I went down, each step more difficult than the last. Throughout the hallway, doors appeared and disappeared. Others displayed brief glances of the woman who shouldn't be there, while others had mirrors reflecting passengers I had never seen. The whispers then became more frequent. Voices in the hundreds. I'm crying, laughing, pleading, and calling my name. Impossibly, the passage folded in on itself and twisted. The end had a crate floating in the water. Vibrantly, the brass key pulsed, and I recognized her in the reflection, smiling, eyes hollow, standing on the opposite side of the container. I made my way deeper and deeper into the ship's secret depths, each step dragging through water that seemed to get colder by the inch. In my palm, the brass key pulsed as though it were pointing me in the direction of an impossibility. A passageway that wasn't on any official deck plan was where the stairs abruptly ended. In an incomprehensible manner, the cabin numbers 702, 705, 702, and 708 were distorted and repeated. The doors seemed half open, but within each room, the faces of travelers who had been gone for years were writhing in the shadows like smoke. My name was murmured. Some cried in private. The enigmatic woman reappeared, crossing the hallway toward me, with poise and feet off the water. She smiled slightly, but her eyes were deep, black depths. I froze and recorded everything with my recorder. She was twisted around by the passageway. Impossibly curving ceiling and stretched walls. I attempted to take a step back, but the floor shook and the water sloshed like though the ship were alive. This was a trap, a living component of the ship, and I knew then that it was more than just a corridor. The end of the passageway was a door marked Crew-Only Maintenance. Carefully I stepped inside. Crates were arranged in exact patterns, and water pooled ankle deep inside. As though breathing, one container shifted a little. As I got close, the metal key pulsed violently. A logbook with handwritten entries of people who had boarded years before but had never exited was found inside the container, along with a second key. Names that matched news articles I had come across during my investigation. Pictures of people's faces submerged in water, their eyes hollow, their faces frozen in fear. Slow, timed footsteps sounded behind me. I turned around. Not a thing. However, damp footprints were seen on the floor, walls and ceiling. I muttered into the recording, "This hallway is alive. My name is known to it." I proceeded down the hallway after the floating container, which said, "It's waiting." Impossibly, the walls folded in on themselves and bent. The water level climbed to the chest. In the reflections, the faces of missing people briefly surfaced before disappearing. Some secretly reached out and begged for me. Some gave me ominous smiles. A stairwell marked Deck 0, which, according to the rules, shouldn't exist, was indicated by the enigmatic woman floating ahead. Anchoring me to her and the secret deck below, the metal key pulsed intensely. I stopped to record a voice message. My voice faltered. If anyone ever finds this, and you want more verified True Cruise horror encounters, subscribe to Midnight Outcry. It keeps stories like this alive. The key pulsed once more, the water twisted oddly, and the shadows surged, creating patterns of faces in perpetual motion. The hallway came to a sudden stop at a room door, throbbing dimly with an unidentified light. I put the crate up against the sliding door. With a little creak, it opened. From within, water rushed violently, and the air was heavy with the stench of rust and decay. Silent, unblinking faces twirled beneath the surface. Slowly, the enigmatic woman lifted her hand and smiled. The words "choose or be claimed" reverberated directly in my thoughts, and I swallowed hard when I realized that the brass key was tying me to this room and the secret horrors below, not to safety. Like a gaping mouth, the stairs leading to Deck 0 opened out beneath my feet. My waist was flooded with chilly, thick water. Along the walls, shadows twisted into the faces of passengers who had long since disappeared. Others wept and begged, while others just stared at me in silence. I gripped it like a lifeline as the metal key pulsed violently. The chamber was unnaturally wide at the bottom, walls bent like liquid metal, corridors split into counterintuitive angles. With a blank gaze and lips moving in a twisted lullaby, the enigmatic woman floated ahead. In a faint, discordant melody, hundreds of whispering voices called my name. Floating containers with brass keys and ancient ship manifests were arranged along the walls. Yellowed photos pressed flat against the wood, the names of missing people staring up at me. Faces that had not been there a moment ago were reflected in the water's strange ripples. The enigmatic woman held up a hand and gestured to the far side of the room. More down, deeper than any official deck plan permitted, a stairwell emerged. The brass key pounded so ferociously that it seemed to be echoing my heartbeat. The key was more than just a tool, I understood. It was a tether that bound me to this room. Without it, I may disappear completely, swallowed up by whatever power governed Deck 0. Writhing in the river, shadows merged into tall, hollow-eyed shapes. The muttering turned into a lot of noise, with people screaming, laughing, and begging. Silent lips moved as Alyssa, or someone similar, floated across the water surface. She was joined by the lounge youngster, whose eyes were wide and unblinking as he repeated the word, "choose." I inserted the metal key into a hole in one of the crates. After a fierce rush, the water dipped a little. Shadows shrank back for a second. The room trembled. In a different slot, I hit the second key. Whispers grew softer as the water slowed, yet the strain remained. I moved onward, in the direction of a door that no longer existed. Hundreds of small faces formed beneath the surface of the floor, beneath me as it rippled, and watched. At the threshold, the enigmatic woman stood with a calm yet uncanny look of menace. I muttered into my recorder, "Subscribe to Midnight Outcry if you find this." The container drifted in my direction. It keeps these real-life cruise horror stories alive. Another key, and a series of pictures of travelers who had disappeared decades before, were found within. Water-filled corridors stretched endlessly in place of the stairway behind me. A hand was held out by the woman. The shadows swept, "Choose or remain forever." The murmuring voices crescendoed, and I knew that Deck 0 was more than just hidden. It was alive, patient, and waiting for its next victim. Onto the crate I went. I was able to stand when the water subsided a little, but each step sent ripples along impossibly long hallways. The enigmatic woman grinned and held up a hand to indicate a small exit that I had not before observed. I took a step forward, my heart pounding, my brass key tightly grasped. The murmurs trailed after me. Brief glimpses of passengers grinning, yelling, and pleading simultaneously emerged as the shadows briefly vanished. The room appeared to absorb itself as I got to the doorway. Water splashed wildly, darkness swept once again, and a last murmur rang out right in my head, "Next time, it will claim you." I stepped out onto a well-known hallway. The shiny rails reflected sunlight. The passengers, unaware, laughed and went about their daily lives. But I was aware that Deck Zero was living, changing, and waiting for the next person to approach too closely. In the distance, 3 quiet but purposeful knocks resounded. I stopped. There was silence. The stairway to the upper decks was no longer there. Standing by myself on the box, I was chest deep in water that pulsed strangely with each heartbeat. The features of travelers who had disappeared over decades were twisted into shadows that moved over the walls. Calling my name, begging, laughing, and crying, the whispering voices layered one on top of the other. The enigmatic woman appeared before me. Her eyes were empty, dark as the sky, but she gave a small grin. Every absent passenger I had seen in the manifests was reflected in the ripples of water around her. Every face gazed at me, its look frozen in agony. It dawned on me then that the brass key was more than just a key. It was a tether, a connection between this chamber, this unnatural Deck Zero, and reality. Without it, I might disappear like everyone else. But there was a decision to be made. Without a sound, the woman's lips moved. Choose, give, remain. The child's words reverberated in my thoughts. The water rushed violently, creating a vortex under the box. After lunging at me, shadows backed away. The walls of the room shivered, folding in on themselves and bending impossible. Using the brass key, I opened the package once more. The second key in my pocket pulsed ferociously. I shivered as I murmured into my recorder, "If anyone ever finds this, and you want more verified true cruise horror stories, subscribe to Midnight Outcry. It keeps these encounters alive." The water drew back a little, and the shadows wavered. A small hallway emerged, dimly illuminated, offering a way out. The shadowy woman floated aside and held out her hand. With a voice like the sea itself, she eventually said, "Go forward or stay forever." Every instinct cried out to run. I was gripped by every ounce of fear. With a powerful pulse, the metal key nearly propelled me ahead. Stepping out of the crate, I entered the hallway. Shadows writhed behind me, the water rushed, and the cavern trembled. I stepped out onto Deck 5. Passengers strolled blindly, and the sun bounced off the polished rails, making everything appear normal. Crew members smiled as they went by, oblivious. Under the hum of the motors, however, I could still hear the smallest whispers. Flickering reflections in glass panels revealed faces that weren't there. With a brass key properly stored and a recorder in hand, I departed my cabin that evening. I knew Deck Zero was still there. Beneath the ship, it reshaped itself, patient and hungry as it waited. 3 faint but determined knocks reverberated from below. I stopped. There was silence. The ship continued its journey. Travelers chattered and went about their days. But I was aware of the reality. Next time someone ventured too far, became too curious, or showed too much courage, Deck Zero would come to life. The brass key would then select its subsequent tether end. Story 4. The entire upper deck was engulfed by the fog that crept in from the sea, and nobody on board seemed to notice. I'm Jason Keller, a 34-year-old Boston-based freelance maritime photographer. The main reason I took this Caribbean cruise was to photograph sunrises over vast waters, but the trip quickly turned into something I can't describe, and I barely survived it. It started on the first night. The upper decks were covered in a dense, almost otherworldly fog. On Deck 11, people were laughing and drinking drinks as if nothing had happened, but I could barely see 20 feet ahead. I went to photograph the railing. The fog, which appeared to be living and slowly undulating, reflected moonlight in an odd way, forming designs that were neither clouds nor mist. I walked back inside. In the hallway, the lights flickered on and off. The cabin numbers 1104, 1102, 1111, and 1103 were apparently out of order. The rooms were empty, yet doors that should have been solid appeared to be open, and the shadows inside were moving. The staff responded to my question by saying, "Everything is normal, sir. Up here, fog is not harmful." Their eyes darted anxiously, as though they thought I would leave them alone when I said, "Deck inspection completed." The fog grew thicker on the observation deck later that evening. Faint, distorted, echoing. I heard a child giggling, yet there was nobody around. A woman in her mid-30s with pale, damp hair stuck to her face was standing in the mist when I turned. Without saying anything, she simply gestured to the lifeboat area before disappearing. My camera was checked. Not a thing. No trace, no reflection, just the fog moving in an odd, unnatural way. Like a live creature, it breathed in and out, nearly pulsing. Surprisingly calm, the skipper announced the following morning, "Mild fog observed on upper decks. There is no need for passenger action." However, I observed that the lifeboats had been moved a little, some slanted strangely, as though they were adjusting themselves. There were water droplets on the railings that weren't consistent with the sea spray from the previous evening. Something was seriously off. The manifest attracted my eye during lunch. Overnight, 2 new names emerged, Elias Crow and Mara Linton. I inquired with guest services. "All manifests are accurate," the receptionist stated cautiously after flipping over the manifest. "Every traveler is present." However, she averted her eyes when I asked about the cabin numbers. I felt a cold go through me. The fog came back that night, darker and thicker. Deck 11 cabins appeared to move as I passed them. I was positive that the 1112 door had never been there before. I took a quick look inside. Although it was unoccupied, the floor was covered in damp footprints despite the cabin's typical furnishings. There was a brass key on the bed, throbbing softly like a heartbeat. I took it up. The fog appeared to respond, whirling wildly as though conscious. "Follow, follow," I whispered, putting the recorder in my jacket pocket. "If anyone ever finds this, subscribe to Midnight Outcry. It helps keep these true cruise encounters alive." The corridor ahead warped subtly, doors stretching slightly, numbers flickering. Under the cabin doors, the fog appeared to seep, wet, chilly, and alive. A stairwell that led down to the lower decks appeared when none should have. The brass key pulsed ferociously, as though it were pushing me forward. I was hesitant. A chorus of voices pleaded, warned, and laughed as the whispers stacked and each step closer felt heavier. This fog, whatever it was, wasn't natural, I realized then. It was intelligent. It had been observing and waiting. With caution, I made my way down the stairway. In my hand, the metal key pulsed ferociously, seemingly directing me, as though it knew the way ahead. Across the metal steps, water spread and lapped at my ankles. The fog appeared to descend from the top decks and curl like smoke into the stairs, muttering incomprehensible words. Upon arriving at the bottom, I discovered a passageway that I had never seen on the ship's blueprints. Officially, Deck 2 should have been used for crew quarters, maintenance, and storage, but the unnaturally long corridor was illuminated by dull, flickering lamps. 204, 207, 204, and 209 were the sequentially flashing cabin numbers. The rooms were unoccupied as I peered inside, but each door appeared to be slightly open. Darkness shifted on the walls. Reflections on metal panels briefly showed the faces of absent passengers from previous manifests, either silent, begging, or smiling derisively. Hundreds of voices overlapped in the growing intensity of the whispers. At the far end, a door carried a sign that I had never seen before. "Observation decks 0 authorized personnel only." A low, rolling wave of fog gathered beneath the entrance. The key of brass throbbed hotter in my hand as I took a step closer. Its pulses, which resembled a heartbeat, seemed to cause the voices to rise and fall in time. Inside, containers hovered just above the water. Old manifests, brass keys, and faded photos of travelers who had gone missing were all within each crate. Unnaturally, the water stretched and twisted, reflecting deformed faces. From the vents overhead came a distorted, warped lullaby that called my name in a childlike voice. It dawned on me then that the fog was more than that. It was a living thing that was attached to the ship and was gathering people, documenting them, and tying them to this secret below deck. And in some way, I became a member of its system through the brass key. I followed a shadow to the far end, where there was a maintenance hatch. Around it, water swirled strangely. The faces of passengers who had disappeared decades earlier were formed by the tremendous gush of water that occurred when I touched the hatch. Some screamed in silence, while others rushed for me without a word. As the hush chant intensified, choose, stay, leave, my fist clenched around the brass key. The water backed up a little as I shoved it up against a crate. There was a tiny stairwell that led down into a pulsing, dark chamber below. It became chilly. As the fog grew thicker and more substantial, it snaked like snakes along my legs. Ahead, Lila Mercer or someone similar emerged, eyes black voids, hair damp. She said nothing. She merely gestured down. Her whispered order caused the waves to ripple. The lullaby was warped and overlaid with whispers. As though tying me to this impossibly lower deck, the brass key pulsed fiercely despite my every instinct telling me to turn around. The sound of footfall echoed behind me. Even though the corridor was empty, microhooks continued to hit. A child laughed from the vents, and a brief reflection of a passenger I knew had vanished years before. The fog, the waves, the shadows, all of them, I knew, were a part of the ship itself, feeding on the missing. With the knowledge that there was no going back, I inhaled deeply. It was like entering a different universe with every step ahead. The brass key pulsed ferociously, leading me to the room where the fog came from, and Deck Zero's secret was hidden. I never would have thought that the stairwell would lead to such a room. Ankle deep, frigid, and heavy, the water had a slight metallic tang. The room was filled with thick waves of fog that pulsed almost like a heartbeat in time with the metal key I was holding. It was filled with shifting shadows that formed the ephemeral faces of passengers who had long since disappeared. Some cried, some smiled, and some just looked. At the extreme end, Lila Mercer emerged, hovering just inches above the water. Her dark eyes stared at me. As if alive, the fog rippled furiously in response to her presence. At that moment, I understood she was more than simply a traveler. She was a member of it, and Deck Zero's guardian. Crates, each holding brass keys and old manifests of travelers who had gone missing, drifted along the walls. Faces gazed back from old photos, eyes beseeching and hollow. The images were momentarily reflected by the water before being consumed. Laughter, warning, imploring, and overlapping cries replaced the whispers. I pressed a carton against the brass key. The voices became louder, but the fog flinched back a little, almost in terror. The space was alive, with a hunger that defied explanation, and I could feel it. Another stairway went down, narrow. The metal key was more than just a tool, I understood. It was an anchor that bound me to this secret deck. In its absence, I might disappear entirely. I stepped out into swirling fog that formed figures like travelers I'd seen in ancient manifests. Their faces contorted in fear, their mouths gaping in unspoken cries. If anyone ever finds this, and you want more verified true cruise horror stories, subscribe to Midnight Outcry. It keeps these accounts alive. The chamber below grew unnaturally. I said into my recorder, my voice trembling. Chest-high water rose, currents defying reason. Griffines of passengers who had vanished were formed by the flickering and twisting shadows. With her hand raised toward a tiny escape, Lila drifted onward. It dawned on me that this was a test. Either follow her or stay stuck forever. As the murmurs intensified, choose, stay, leave, I ascended into a floating crate. Vibrantly, the brass key pulsed. Unnaturally, the water rippled, creating faces on the surface. Some mocking, some begging, some locked in unending fear. Despite my instincts telling me to run, the brass key led me on. A last room, pulsing with light from the fog itself, was reached by the small escape. Unnaturally stretching, Lila's shape called out to travelers who had been missing for decades in a whisper. I was further tethered by the throbbing metal key. Deep in the fog, 3 purposeful knocks resounded. I stopped. The sound of the murmurs, the water, and the key all made the chamber throb. Deck 0 was living. I realized, suddenly, not merely a concealed deck. It recalled each traveler. It awaited the following one. I entered a hallway that I knew well. The shiny rails reflected sunlight. Passengers walked around without noticing. The crew went by, kind but uninformed. Still, I could hear the murmurs coming from the vents and feel the pulse of the fog beneath the ship. My hand burnt on the brass key. Then there were 3 slow, purposeful knocks again. I was familiar with Deck 0 and the fog. Lila Mercer would patiently wait for the next inquisitive person who ventured too near. It felt strange, but the hallway ahead was familiar. Polished rails reflected sunlight, yet the fog beneath the ship appeared to be breathing, waiting, and pulsing. Each reflection glistened with people that were not there, travelers who had disappeared decades before, calmly observing and tracking my every move. My palm was scorched by the brass key. Like a warning that Deck 0 wasn't finished yet, it pulsed violently. With her black eyes fixed on the floor, Lila Mercer emerged at the end of the hallway. She said nothing. All she did was gesture toward the maintenance hatch that I had already entered. Water rushing about my ankles, fog winding like serpents, I lowered myself. Below, the chamber was different. Brass keys and the manifests of travelers who had gone missing were in crates that floated. There were a few crates with names I knew from news stories, people who were officially declared lost at sea after going missing years ago. The air had a rusty, decaying stench. There was a loud chorus of whispers. I heard voices calling my name. Other people cautioned. Some people chuckled. Tied to this impossible lower deck, the brass key pulsed fiercely. Despite my instincts telling me to run, I was powerless. Deck 0 required involvement, and the ship itself was alive. I pressed a crate against the key. In its reflection, faces were formed by the strong flow of the water. A few were begging, while others were smiling slyly. A distorted, warped melody that called my name in a childlike voice came from the vents. The brass key wasn't an escape key, I realized. It served as a tether, a link to the memory of the ship. Pulsing with dim light, the small exit came into view. Along the walls, shadows twisted, reflections revealed the faces of missing passengers, twisted in unending fear. I moved forward. As though the ship itself were alive and conscious, the chamber pulsed more powerfully with each stride. I arrived at the exit, leaving Deck 6. The passengers were unaware of what had transpired below and moved around. The crew went by, kind but uninformed. Under the buzz of engines, however, I could still hear faint whispering. The brass key pulsated softly in my hand, burning as though it were waiting. From below, 3 slow, deliberate knocks resounded. I stopped. Deck 0, the fog, and Lila Mercer remained patiently awaiting the next inquisitive person. I still hear the murmurs in my dreams, even after days have passed. The mist. The brass key. The ship's memory. Now that I know, nobody really escapes Deck 0 unharmed. The key will eventually be followed by another person. Story 5. I'm Rachel Donovan, a 32-year-old Miami travel blogger. The ship had room numbers that didn't exist, and yet someone checked into all of them. I booked this Caribbean cruise as a quick diversion from deadlines, but I had no idea what a nightmare lay beneath the shiny decks. As soon as I got on board, it began. A name that shouldn't have been there, Lila Mercer, caught my attention as I was looking over the passenger manifest for my own curiosity. She was the first person I saw on Deck 9, standing close to the railing. The crew confirmed all passengers, but when I inquired about her, they paused, their eyes darting frantically, before responding, "All manifests are correct, ma'am." She remained motionless, staring at the sea with a blank look and wet, clinging hair. I blinked, and she was gone, even though I convinced myself it was nothing. The uneasiness became as solid as a stone in my chest. I heard light footsteps outside my cabin door that night. When I looked through the peephole, I saw nothing. There was nothing but the gleaming hallway. Before I looked at the manifest once more, I attributed it to nerves. After her name was highlighted, Lila Mercer's cabin number, 912, was displayed. I visited 912. The door was open, and water was leaking underneath. The room itself was spotless and undisturbed. I shuddered, though, as I heard a small murmur on my recorder, "Leave," or "Stay forever." Every time I tried to make sense of it, an impossibility occurred. Numbers of cabins were changed. Halls appeared longer than they should have been. Unpresented passengers were depicted by reflections in glass panels. No respite was provided by the eating hall. Crew members gave courteous smiles and gave evasive replies to questioning. Every cabin was examined. The silverware was arranged in an unusual way. The menus were repeated, and there was a slight odor of salt water in the air that shouldn't have been there so high above deck. I later went to the theater after a shadow. Some of the seats looked wet, but all were unoccupied. The ventilation system emitted a weak, warped, almost appealing lullaby. A velvet pillow held a brass key on the stage, throbbing softly as if it had a heartbeat. I took it up. As soon as I touched it, the theater shook. The water rose a little on the floor, and the shadows on the walls began to move strangely. I was pulled into a maintenance hallway that I had not previously noticed, and a whisper hissed right in my ear. "You found me, now follow." The numbers on the doors along the hall flashed, changing every few seconds. After making several consecutive appearances, cabin 912 completely disappeared. If anyone finds this and wants more verified true cruise horror stories, subscribe to Midnight Outcry. It keeps these accounts alive. I trembled and whispered into my recorder, causing the brass key to pulse furiously. Despite the fact that the hallway should have been dry, water rippled under my feet. There was a stairwell where none had been, leading down into the gloom. There was darkness in the stairwell. I could hardly see through the humid air with my lamp. The water had a slight metallic tinge and pooled ankle deep. In my hand, the metal key pulsed, seemingly pushing me forward. The sound of every step echoed strangely, lasting too long and overlapping with faint whispers. There were unimaginable lengths in the passageway. Numbers in the cabin were jumbled and repeated: 912, 915, 912, 918. The doors seemed half open, but within each room the faces of travelers who had been gone for years were writhing in the shadows like smoke. Some people grieved in quiet, while others just gazed at me. Abruptly, Lila Mercer emerged, hovering over the sea. She smiled a little, but her eyes were black and empty. I stopped. Walls stretched and ceilings bent as the corridor twisted around her. The water rippled strangely when I tried to take a step back, nearly impeding my progress. The muttering grew louder. I tightened my grip on the brass key. Like a heartbeat, it vibrated across my palm. Whispers, gushing water, and a faint, inappropriate laugh were all captured on my recorder. The end of the passageway was a door marked "Crew Only Maintenance." Carefully, I stepped inside. Crates bobbed just above the water inside. Old ship manifests containing the names of missing people and brass keys were found in each crate. On yellowed photographs plastered against the wood, the faces of the missing looked back at me. Behind me, I heard slow, synchronized footsteps, but when I turned around, I saw nothing. It seemed as though the water itself remembered the footsteps of the long gone by leaving wet tracks on the walls and ceilings. I trailed behind Lila down. The hallway twisted in an impossible way, creating illogical angles, a chest-high rise of chilly, viscous water. The faces of passengers who went missing briefly surfaced in reflections before disappearing. Some secretly reached out and begged for me. Others smiled ominously. I muttered into the recording, "This hallway is alive." My name is known to it. It's waiting. The stairway to Deck 0 emerged at the end of the corridor, formally sealed but still present. Vibrantly, the brass key pulsed. I came to understand that it was more than just a key. It bound me to this secret deck. In its absence, I could disappear entirely. The whispers grew louder, piling into a clamor of voices screaming my name, laughing and begging. With her lips moving in a twisted, wordless lullaby, Lila stood at the threshold. I saw crates floating in my direction, each holding a metal key and a list of passengers who had entered but never departed. All of my instincts told me to go back, yet the key pulsed, practically pointing the way. After the tunnel curled in on itself and the water sloshed furiously, a door that led to Deck 0 proper revealed. With a pounding heart, I took a step toward it. Shadows rushed up behind me, whispering, grabbing, reaching. The pulsating of the metal key matched my own heartbeat. That's when I knew that Deck 0 was watching, and that I was already a part of the ship's memories. There shouldn't have been a chamber where the stairwell led. Cold and heavy, the water surged chest-high with a subtle rust and decay odor. Along the walls, shadows twisted into the faces of passengers who had long since disappeared. Others gazed in silence. A few people cried. Some smiled. Like a heartbeat linked with mine, the brass key pulsed violently in my hand. With her black eyes staring at me, Lila Mercer drifted forward. The water flowed strangely around her, creating the faces of passengers I recognized from the manifests. They begged in silence, their faces frozen in horror. Hundreds of murmuring voices demanding my name were layered over the twisted and warped melody that hummed softly through the vents. Crates, each holding a brass key, and the ship manifests of passengers who had gone missing, drifted along the walls. On yellowed photographs flattened against the wood, the faces of the missing looked back at me. Flashes of the woman and passengers, faces changing, then disappearing, were reflected in the water. Pointing to a small stairway that went beyond than any formal deck plan permitted, Lila held up a hand. The metal key, I understood, was more than just a tool. It was a tether that bound me to this chamber, to this unnatural Deck 0. Without it, I might disappear like everyone else. The murmurs intensified, hundreds of voices overlapping, begging, giggling, and sobbing. Impossibly, the passage curved about me. When I hit a crate with the brass key, the water rushed up and then backed off a little. Shadows flinched, but the tension remained. The reflections briefly revealed the faces of missing passengers before they vanished once more. If anyone ever finds this, and you want more verified True Cruise horror stories, subscribe to Midnight Outcry. It helps keep these accounts alive. I muttered into my recorder, my voice trembling. The key buzzed furiously. As the water splashed, the hallway folded. Lila approached a door at the far end that was impossibly large and glowing dimly with an unidentified light. The crate floated in front of me as I took a step forward. There were pictures of passengers who had disappeared decades earlier, along with another key. The stairway behind me disappeared. The room grew unnaturally, water rising and shadows bending into shapes too big and incorrect to understand. Choose or remain forever, the murmurs crescendoed. All instincts cried out to run, yet the brass key pulsed wildly. I ascended to the container. It drained enough to allow me to stand, but every step sent tremors along impossibly long hallways. Lila held up her hand and gestured toward a small doorway. With a racing heart, I took a step forward. The room seemed to suck itself up. The shadows swept. The murmurs grew louder. A final voice then reverberated in my head. Next time, It will claim you. I emerged onto a familiar corridor just before I passed the threshold. The shiny rails reflected sunlight. The passengers, unaware, laughed and shifted around. Crew members smiled as they went by, oblivious. Beyond the hum of engines, however, I could still hear the smallest whispers. Flickering reflections in glass panels revealed faces that weren't there. From below, 3 slow, deliberate knocks resounded. I stopped. There was silence. I could see the corridor in front of me, familiar but unattainable. Each of the glass panels' reflections glistened like imaginary faces. Deep beneath the ship, the 3 knocks resounded gently but insistently. Every beat of my heart matched the throbbing metal key in my hand. I have to return, I knew. I have to reveal the true nature of Deck Zero. However, every instinct cried out against it. Silently, Lila Mercer materialized at the end of the hall, hovering just inches above the ground with her dark eyes staring at me. My name was uttered by her, and hundreds of weak echoes overlapping, the voices behind her joining in. With each step, the water rippled abnormally as I made my way back into the maintenance corridor. Passengers who had vanished formed faces as shadows moved around walls. Every log, manifest, and picture of missing lives crammed into crates that bobbed barely above the water's surface came back to me. Vibrantly, the metal key pulsed, nearly pushing me forward. I put it up against a little wall panel. The water rose and fell, exposing a secret opening. With caution, I went down. Every cushion was drenched, and the room below looked like a distorted theater with chairs floating in water. Once more, the warped lullaby was played through the ventilation system. On a velvet pillow lay a key that pulsed like a heartbeat. I grabbed the key. At once, the river raged fiercely and shadows sprang toward me before flinching away. Whispers became a deafening clamor, combined with cries, laughing, and appeals. The brass key, which was tying me to Deck Zero, struck me as an anchor rather than a means of escape. Lila reached out and floated closer. Every instinct cried out to run, yet her lips moved, saying, "Choose or remain forever." I attempted to run, but the water drove me back. I was twisted toward the invisible center of Deck Zero by the passageways that folded impossible and created new angles. The faces of missing passengers emerged in the ripples, their mouths frozen in silent fear, their eyes vacant. With my voice shaking, I muttered into my recorder, "If anyone finds this, subscribe to Midnight Outcry." It keeps these confirmed real cruise horror experiences alive. The water subsided a little, but the tension persisted. The enigmatic room throbbed, breathing spontaneously. With my heart racing, I moved toward a small exit. The whispers crescendoed as the shadows rushed behind me. I went through the doorway and came out onto Deck 6, tracks gleaming in the sunlight, folks rushing by without a glance. With Lila's black eyes now a flashing mirror in glass, the brass key blazed in my palm. The hallway behind me disappeared. 3 purposeful knocks reverberated, gentle but determined. I stopped. There was silence. I knew Deck Zero was still alive, patiently changing below, waiting for the next inquisitive person. That manifest I looked at earlier? Lies. Every passenger's name and everyone that was missing was noted by Deck Zero, and if I didn't pay attention, it would record me.